September 7, 1929, 3:15 a.m. Frank Capone's blood was still warm when Al Capone found his brother's body in the alley behind Murphy's Tavern. 6 bullets to the chest. A note pinned to Frank's coat that read, "Tell Scarface his family isn't untouchable." Al Capone knelt in his brother's blood, his hands shaking not with fear, but with a rage so pure it would turn Chicago into a battlefield. In the next 72 hours, 17 men would die, the North Side Gang would cease to exist, and the streets of Chicago would run so red with blood that the mayor would declare martial law for the first time in the city's history. But here's what the history books won't tell you. Frank Capone's murder wasn't random gang violence. It was the biggest mistake his killers ever made, because it awakened something in Al Capone that even his enemies didn't know existed. A monster willing to burn down all of Chicago to avenge his family. What nobody understood that night, what even Al Capone's closest associates didn't realize until the bodies started dropping, was that Frank Capone had been more than just Al's younger brother. He had been his conscience, the one person who could calm Al's violent impulses and talk him out of the most brutal retaliation. With Frank dead, there was nobody left to hold Al Capone back from becoming the most dangerous man in America. To understand the massacre that followed Frank's murder, you need to understand who Frank Capone was in September 1929. Unlike his famous older brother, Frank had tried to stay away from the family business. He ran a legitimate restaurant, dated a school teacher, and dreamed of opening a chain of Italian eateries across Chicago. He was the brother Al Capone was trying to protect from the criminal life that had consumed the rest of the Capone family. But Frank's innocence had made him a target. The North Side Gang, led by Vincent Mad Dog Moran, had been losing territory to Al Capone for months. Their liquor shipments were being hijacked. Their speakeasies were being shut down. Their soldiers were defecting to the more powerful Chicago outfit. In desperation, they had decided to hit Al Capone where they thought he was most vulnerable. "We can't beat Capone in a straight fight," Moran had told his lieutenants during a meeting at their headquarters on September 5th. "But we can hurt him. We can take away what he loves most and watch him suffer." What Moran didn't understand was that targeting Frank Capone wasn't just an attack on Al's family, it was a declaration of war against a man who had built his entire empire on the principle that certain lines should never be crossed. And the North Side Gang had just crossed the most sacred line of all. September 6th, 1929, 11 p.m., 18 hours before Frank's murder. Frank Capone was closing his restaurant when 3 men in dark suits approached him on the street. Frank recognized one of them, Tommy the Knife Morrison, one of Mad Dog Moran's most trusted killers. "Frank Capone?" Morrison asked, though he obviously knew the answer. "What do you want?" Frank replied, trying to keep his voice steady. He had always feared this day would come, the day when his brother's enemies would find him. "Your brother's been causing problems for our organization," Morrison said calmly. "We want you to deliver a message." "I don't get involved in Al's business," Frank said. "I run a restaurant. That's all." Morrison smiled coldly. "I know, that's what makes you perfect for delivering our message." What happened next would haunt Al Capone for the rest of his life. The 3 men forced Frank into an alley behind Murphy's Tavern. They made him kneel in the dirt, and then Morrison pulled out a .45 caliber pistol and shot Frank 6 times in the chest while the other 2 men held him down. As Frank lay dying, Morrison pinned a note to his coat. "Tell your brother this is what happens when he forgets his place," Morrison said to Frank's dying face. "The North Side Gang doesn't back down." Frank Capone died alone in that alley, bleeding to death while his killers walked away, laughing about the message they had sent to Chicago's most feared crime boss. But they had no idea what kind of monster they had awakened. September 7th, 1929, 3:15 a.m. Al Capone received the phone call that would change Chicago forever. His restaurant manager had found Frank's body and called the police, who had immediately contacted Al. By the time Al arrived at the crime scene, Frank's body was covered with a sheet, but the blood in the alley told the story of what had happened. Al Capone pulled back the sheet and looked at his brother's face for the last time. Frank looked peaceful, almost like he was sleeping, except for the 6 bullet holes in his chest and the note that was still pinned to his coat. Al read the note 3 times. Each reading made his rage burn hotter. By the 3rd reading, his hands were shaking so violently that he could barely hold the paper. "Boss," said Frank Nitti, who had arrived with Al at the crime scene. "What do you want us to do?" Al Capone looked up from his brother's body with eyes that Nesty would later describe as completely empty of everything except murder. "I want them all dead," Al said quietly. "Every single member of the North Side gang. I want their families dead. I want their friends dead. I want everyone who ever shook hands with Mad Dog Moran to die screaming." "Boss, that's a lot of people. Maybe we should—" "Frank was innocent," Al interrupted. "He never hurt anyone. He just wanted to run his restaurant and live a normal life, and they killed him to send me a message." Al Capone stood up and looked around the alley where his brother had died. "Well, Frank's going to send them a message too. And that message is that you don't kill a Capone and live to talk about it." What Nessie didn't understand at that moment was that he was witnessing the birth of the most brutal gang war in Chicago history. Al Capone wasn't just planning revenge. He was planning to erase the North Side Gang from existence so completely that people would forget they ever existed. September 7, 1929, 6 a.m. While the sun rose over Chicago, Al Capone was already putting his plan for revenge into motion. He called an emergency meeting of every soldier, lieutenant, and associate in his organization. By 7 a.m., over 100 armed men had gathered in the basement of the Four Deuces Club. "Gentlemen," Al said, standing in front of the assembled crowd, "last night the North Side Gang murdered my brother Frank. They killed an innocent man to send me a message about knowing my place." The room fell completely silent. Everyone present understood that Frank Capone had been off limits, the one member of the Capone family who was supposed to be safe from the violence of organized crime. "Today we're going to send them a message back," Al continued. "But our message is going to be written in blood. I want every member of the North Side Gang dead by sunset tomorrow. I want their headquarters burned to the ground. I want their families to flee Chicago in terror. I want their memory erased from this city." Jack McGurn, Al's chief enforcer, raised his hand. "Boss, that's war. The cops will come down hard on all of us." "Let them come," Al replied. "Frank was the only thing keeping me civilized. Now that he's gone, Chicago is going to learn what Al Capone looks like when he stops playing by the rules." What followed was the most systematic extermination of a criminal organization in American history. Al Capone didn't just want to defeat the North Side Gang. He wanted to make their destruction so complete and so brutal that no other gang would ever dare to target his family again. September 7, 1929, 10 a.m. The war began with the murder of Tommy Morrison, the man who had pulled the trigger on Frank Capone. Morrison was leaving his apartment building when 4 of Al's soldiers surrounded him on the street. They didn't give him a chance to draw his weapon or call for help. They shot him 37 times with Thompson submachine guns, leaving his body so riddled with bullets that the coroner needed dental records to identify him. But Morrison's death was just the beginning. By noon, 3 more North Side Gang members had been found dead in various locations around Chicago. By 3 p.m., the number had risen to 7. By sunset, 12 members of Mad Dog Moran's organization had been eliminated in what newspapers would later call Black Saturday. Each murder was more brutal than the last. Al Capone's soldiers weren't just killing their enemies, they were sending a message about what happened to people who targeted the Capone family. September 8, 1929, the second day of the war. Mad Dog Moran called an emergency meeting of his remaining soldiers. Of the 43 men who had belonged to his organization on September 6, only 28 were still alive. The others had been systematically hunted down and executed by Al Capone's army. "This is madness," said Eddie. "The Fish Romano, one of Moran's lieutenants. Capone's lost his mind. He's killing everyone associated with us, including people who had nothing to do with Frank's murder." "I know," Moran replied, his face pale with fear. "But we can't back down now. If we show weakness, every gang in Chicago will think they can walk all over us." What Moran didn't realize was that it was already too late for the North Side Gang. Al Capone had committed the full resources of his organization to their destruction, and he wasn't going to stop until every single member was dead. September 8, 1929, 2 p.m. The war escalated when Al Capone's soldiers attacked the North Side Gang's headquarters on North State Street. 15 of Al's men surrounded the building and opened fire with automatic weapons, turning the 3-story structure into a war zone. The battle lasted 47 minutes. When it ended, 8 members of the North Side Gang were dead, and their headquarters was completely destroyed. The building burned for 6 hours, and the smoke could be seen from 10 miles away. But the most shocking part of the attack wasn't the violence. It was what Al Capone did after the shooting stopped. He walked into the burning building alone, found Mad Dog Moran's office, and left a photograph of Frank Capone on Moran's desk with a note that read, "This is what you took from me. Now I'm going to take everything from you." September 9th, 1929, the final day of the war. Mad Dog Moran woke up to discover that only 6 members of his organization were still alive. In 3 days, Al Capone had systematically eliminated 37 of his soldiers, burned down his headquarters, and driven his remaining supporters into hiding. "We have to surrender," Eddie Romano told Moran during a meeting in an abandoned warehouse. "Capone's going to kill all of us if we don't end this." "Surrender to who?" Moran asked desperately. "Capone isn't accepting surrenders. He wants us all dead." That's when they received a phone call that would end the war. The voice on the other end belonged to Al Capone himself. "Mad Dog," Al said calmly, "this is Al Capone. I have a proposition for you." "What kind of proposition?" Moran asked, his voice shaking. "I want you to meet me tonight at Graceland Cemetery. Come alone. We're going to settle this face to face." "Why should I trust you?" "Because," Al replied, "if I wanted you dead right now, you'd already be dead. This is about more than just killing you. This is about making sure everyone in Chicago understands what happens when you kill a Capone." September 9th, 1929, 11 p.m. Mad Dog Moran arrived at Graceland Cemetery to find Al Capone standing alone next to Frank's fresh grave. Al was wearing a black suit and holding a single white rose. "You came," Al said without turning around. "You said you wouldn't kill me if I came," Moran replied nervously. "I lied," Al said, finally turning to face his brother's killer. "But I'm not going to kill you here. Frank deserves better than having your blood spilled on his grave." "Then why am I here?" Al placed the white rose on Frank's grave and walked toward Moran. "You're here because I want you to understand something. Frank was innocent. He never hurt anyone. He just wanted to run his restaurant and live a peaceful life. And you killed him to send me a message." "It was just business," Moran said weakly. "No," Al replied. "It was the biggest mistake of your life. Because now I'm going to send a message to every criminal in America. I'm going to make sure they understand that the Capone family is completely off limits." That's when Al Capone revealed what he had planned for Mad Dog Moran. It wasn't going to be a quick bullet to the head or a brutal beating. It was going to be something much worse. "Starting tomorrow, you're going to leave Chicago," Al said. "You're going to abandon everything you've built here, and you're going to spend the rest of your life running from me." "What do you mean?" "I mean," Al continued, "that I'm going to let you live. But every day for the rest of your life, you're going to wake up wondering if this is the day I decide to kill you. Every shadow you see could be one of my men. Every phone call could be your death sentence. Every stranger on the street could be your executioner." Al Capone smiled coldly. "Frank died in 6 seconds. You're going to die slowly over years from the fear of what I might do to you." Mad Dog Moran left Chicago that night and never returned. He spent the remaining 15 years of his life as a broken man, constantly looking over his shoulder, jumping at every sound, living in terror of the day Al Capone might finally come for him. But Al Capone never did. The psychological torture of constant fear was a more fitting punishment than death for the man who had killed Frank Capone. September 10th, 1929, the morning after, Chicago woke up to find that the North Side Gang no longer existed. In 4 days, Al Capone had eliminated an entire criminal organization, killed 37 men, and driven their leader out of the city. The newspapers called it the September Massacre. The police called it the worst gang violence in Chicago history, but Al Capone called it justice for his brother. The psychological impact of Frank Capone's revenge lasted for decades. Every criminal organization in America learned the same lesson: the Capone family was completely untouchable. Even the federal government began treating Al Capone with a new level of respect, understanding that they were dealing with a man capable of extraordinary violence when his family was threatened. Years later, when federal investigators tried to understand how Al Capone had become so powerful, they would trace it back to September 1929. The brothers' revenge had established Al as more than just another crime boss. It had made him the undisputed emperor of American organized crime. The 17 men who died during those 4 days in September weren't just casualties of a gang war. They were examples of what happened when someone crossed the most dangerous line in criminal history, threatening the family of Al Capone. If this story of family loyalty and brutal revenge moved you, hit that subscribe button, Share this with someone who understands that in the criminal underworld, some bonds are worth killing for and some betrayals demand blood. Drop a comment below. Do you think Al Capone's revenge was justified, or did he go too far? Turn those notifications on, because next week we're telling the story of how Al Capone's final battle with the federal government led to a confrontation that changed organized crime forever. Remember, in the world of family and loyalty, the greatest love can create the greatest violence. And Al Capone proved that when you take away everything that matters to a dangerous man, you don't just make an enemy, you create a monster.